सादर प्रणाम और दिल से सलाम। तलाक दे तो रहे हो इताब व कहर के साथ, मेरा शबाब भी लौटा दो मेरे महर के साथ. You divorce me with such fury and threat of punishment, but at least also give me back my youth and my alimony. One of the most topical issues in India today is that of triple talaq, which is practiced among certain sects of the Muslim community. This form of divorce not only places the prerogative of giving a divorce on men, but indeed is seen to be binding if in one sitting the word talaq, divorce, is uttered 3 times by a man to his wife. There have been some almost comical situations where men have tried to divorce their spouses through SMSs, emails, telephone calls, but as with all such things, they have also been completely blown out of proportion by the media and politicians. The practice of triple talaq, however, continues to be a political hot potato, with various parties taking up strong positions about it, ostensibly to empower and liberate Muslim women. Here it is important to mention that large sections of the Muslim population, including the Shia and various Sunni groups such as the Ahl Hadith, find no theological or jurisprudential basis for triple talaq. Before we get into a detailed discussion of the topic in India, it might be worthwhile laying out some broader context and history. The practice of divorce is sanctioned by the Quran, albeit with a number of important caveats. You will notice in both the verses that you just read that there is an emphasis on reconciliation, and therefore divorce is certainly treated as something highly undesirable, but of course provisions are made for overcoming intractable differences. There are a number of verses, such as verse 7 of chapter 65, verse 231 of chapter 2, which deal with alimony as well as maintenance and providing accommodation for the divorcee. However, the verse which has been interpreted to sanction triple talaq is from chapter 2, verse 230. فَإِنَّ طَلَّقَاهَا فَلَا تَحِلُّ لَهُ is how the verse begins. And the word طَلَّقَاهَا, which is sometimes translated as final or absolute divorce, was interpreted by some Muslim scholars as the third and final time. In this sense, there is no explicit mention of triple talaq in the Quran. The original logic was not that divorce was pronounced 3 times in one go, but that after the first and second time, there should still be the possibility of retracting the divorce. The original debate about triple talaq goes back to the time of the Prophet. Indeed, in Sunni Muslim sources, there is a narration of Abdullah ibn Abbas about a famous wrestler, Rukana ibn Abi Yazid, who in the heat of the moment pronounced divorce 3 times and then regretted it. The Prophet then asked him to swear an oath about asking whether he intended a single divorce, and when Rukana agreed, the divorce was treated as annulled. So we see then that there are prophetic precedents that at the very least frown upon this practice. Of course, the intricacies of the debates in the ahadith and prophetic precedent notwithstanding, triple talaq historically became common within certain Sunni communities, and indeed a large majority of both Shia and Sunni Muslims, as I said earlier, do not see it as a valid form of divorce. In fact, more than 20 Muslim majority countries, including Egypt and Pakistan, have legislated against the practice and outlawed it. Indeed, in Egypt there is legislation that grants women the unilateral right to divorce with or without the husband's consent. We see then that the issue is something that Muslim scholars in recent times have thought about deeply. But of course, there is one main difference. The changes in these societies were organic. In other words, the reforms emerged from within, and therefore both the law and the authority behind the law were accepted by the people. We often forget that it is not enough to just legislate change, but it is equally important to consider the source of authority from which the law is derived. This is where the Indian situation is unique, because triple talaq has become an issue that is clothed in the language of women's empowerment, but is essentially also a political stick with which to beat the Muslim community. Triple talaq as a policy advocated by the government cannot be seen independently from its other policies and stands vis-à-vis the Muslim community. One is forced to wonder why, on the one hand, members of the government and ruling parties make derogatory statements about Muslims and Muslim women, indeed women in general, while on the other hand, their colleagues seek to empower them. Ultimately, criminalizing triple talaq will be useless until and unless the issue is reformed from within the community. At a time when Muslims feel besieged, the wiser course of action would be to empower people to change themselves from within. But of course, this means making the broader atmosphere more conducive to reform and change. Any change from outside is bound to lead to an adverse reaction, which will inevitably only entrench prevalent views and make people turn inwards. If people do not trust the source of the law, then they will certainly not willingly accept the law. Of course, there is the point of view that sometimes change needs to be imposed regardless of whether the community is ready for it or not. And indeed, this is the one way in which 18th and 19th century liberal philosophers and thinkers justified imperialism as a civilizing process. The reaction to this conceit is there for everyone to see in the form of the various religious reform movements that entrenched certain forms of orthodoxy. The argument made is that the Supreme Court will merely be affirming the position of the Quran and will not be using another source of authority, but the problem is that the timing and context in which this law is being advocated cannot be divorced, no pun intended, from the prevalent political context. Perhaps the wisest course of action will be to let leaders from those sects who practice triple talaq sit with judges, jurists and lawyers and forge a path which will catalyze change organically while also giving it the weight of the law. Ultimately, the problem in the current debates is that triple talaq has become a political football, and therefore it is important to not involve politicians in this process.